On September 21st, 1938, an unrelenting force of nature tore through New England, leaving an indelible mark on the region's history. The Great New England Hurricane, later nicknamed the Long Island Express due to its swift and unexpected arrival, became one of the most devastating natural disasters to ever strike the northeastern United States. In a matter of hours, it claimed the lives of over 600 people, caused injuries to thousands more, and left countless communities utterly unrecognizable. The storm's ferocity was unmatched. It first formed as a tropical wave off the coast of Africa, traveling across the Atlantic Ocean, where warm waters fueled its growth into a formidable hurricane. By the time it reached the southeastern United States, meteorologists had grossly underestimated its trajectory. Believing it would veer out to sea, little warning was given to residents along the northeastern coast. In truth, the hurricane was barreling straight for New England at an alarming speed of nearly 70 miles per hour, faster than any hurricane previously recorded. New England was particularly vulnerable to such an event. At the time, weather forecasting was rudimentary at best. The region lacked the satellite technology and sophisticated warning systems we take for granted today. This left residents unaware of the magnitude of the storm, many continuing their daily routines as disaster approached. Adding to this, the infrastructure was ill-prepared for such an assault. Homes, businesses, and roads were constructed without consideration for hurricane-strength winds or catastrophic flooding. The context in which the storm arrived made its impact even more harrowing. The late 1930s were marked by economic strife. As the Great Depression lingered on, many communities were still reeling from the historic floods of 1936, which had decimated homes and livelihoods across the region. For families struggling to rebuild, the 1938 hurricane was not just a natural disaster, it was an unimaginable blow to their chances of recovery. The storm brought a unique and destructive element rarely seen in the region, a storm surge of unparalleled force. As it made landfall on Long Island and moved northward, it pushed an enormous wall of water into coastal communities. Towns like Westerly, Rhode Island, and New London, Connecticut, were among the first to experience the storm's wrath. The surge obliterated homes, docks, and entire neighborhoods, leaving survivors clinging to rooftops or swept away entirely. This was just the beginning. The storm's devastation would stretch far beyond these first few hours, spreading across New England with unimaginable speed and ferocity. As the Great New England Hurricane made its approach, the region's unpreparedness set the stage for disaster. By mid-morning on September 21, 1938, dark clouds began to gather along the southern New England coastline, and the winds picked up with unnerving speed. Yet few recognized the signs of the impending catastrophe. This was a time before widespread hurricane education. Many residents assumed such storms couldn't reach the northeastern United States with significant force. What followed was a tragedy of staggering proportions. When the storm made landfall on Long Island shortly after noon, it unleashed winds of over 120 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 150 miles per hour. Buildings were torn apart as if made of paper, and trees, some centuries old, were uprooted in seconds. Entire forests were leveled, and the sound of snapping trunks and howling winds created an eerie soundtrack to the devastation. By the time the storm crossed the Long Island Sound and struck southern New England, it had evolved into a once-in-a-lifetime meteorological event. The hurricane's speed compounded its destructive power, giving residents little time to react. In the coastal towns of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, the storm surge surged as high as 17 feet in some areas, inundating homes, businesses, and critical infrastructure. Rivers such as the Connecticut and Merrimack overflowed, spreading the floodwaters far inland. In Providence, Rhode Island, the devastation was particularly severe. Downtown streets became rivers, with floodwaters rising to over 13 feet in some areas. Entire neighborhoods were submerged, and the power grid collapsed, leaving the city in total darkness. Across the state, coastal communities like Narragansett and Westerly bore the brunt of the storm's fury. Stories emerged of residents climbing onto rooftops or clinging to debris to survive. For many, help was simply too far away to arrive in time. Compounding the chaos was the hurricane's unpredictable path. Meteorologists had expected the storm to move out to sea, leading many in northern New England to believe they were safe. Instead, the hurricane made an abrupt turn northward, catching even experienced weather forecasters off guard. This miscalculation allowed false confidence to spread among the population, further delaying evacuation and preparation efforts. As the storm pushed further inland, its reach extended into Vermont, New Hampshire, and parts of Maine, where hurricane-strength winds and heavy rainfall caused rivers to overflow. In Massachusetts, Boston experienced severe flooding and wind damage, though the city was spared the worst of the storm surge. Rural areas, however, were hit hard with barns, silos, and farmhouses destroyed, leaving many families homeless overnight. While the wind and rain were terrifying enough, one of the hurricane's most chilling features was its speed. Moving at an average of 47 miles per hour, it allowed little time for emergency responders or civilians to organize rescue efforts. The storm's ferocity and swiftness left a lasting impression on those who lived through it, a haunting reminder of how unpredictable and deadly nature can be. As the storm's violent core tore through New England, the human toll mounted rapidly. Entire families were caught in the crossfire of relentless winds and rising waters, their lives upended in an instant. Survivors would recount harrowing tales of perseverance in the face of unimaginable odds, stories that revealed both the immense cruelty of the storm and the resilience of those who endured it. In coastal communities, the storm surge proved particularly lethal. In towns like Westerly, Rhode Island, walls of water swept away entire streets, dragging homes, vehicles, and people into the ocean. Families scrambled to higher ground, often taking refuge in attics, only to find themselves trapped as water levels continued to rise. For many, the race to escape became a desperate battle against time. In one chilling account, a man clung to a floating door for hours, battered by debris, until he was eventually rescued by a passing boat. The hurricane's ferocity extended far inland, catching rural residents off guard. In the Connecticut River Valley, farmers faced devastation as barns were flattened, livestock drowned, and crops were obliterated by the torrential rain. Entire communities were left isolated, with roads washed out and bridges destroyed, leaving rescue teams unable to reach those in need. In Vermont and New Hampshire, flash floods turned serene streams into raging torrents, sweeping away anything in their path. The economic toll on New Englanders was catastrophic. Many small business owners lost their livelihoods overnight, with storefronts reduced to rubble or submerged under feet of water. Fishermen, a cornerstone of the region's economy, saw their boats destroyed and harbors rendered unusable. The already fragile economy, still recovering from the Great Depression, was dealt a crushing blow, leaving many families struggling to rebuild without financial resources or government aid. Heroism emerged amid the chaos. In Providence, police officers and firefighters braved the floodwaters to rescue stranded residents, forming human chains to guide people to safety. The U.S. Coast Guard deployed ships and personnel to recover survivors from wreckage-strewn waters, often risking their lives in the process. In smaller communities, neighbors banded together to provide makeshift shelters, share food, and care for the injured. One of the most poignant aspects of the disaster was its impact on children. In New London, Connecticut, a schoolhouse was swept away by the storm surge, trapping students and teachers inside. While many perished, some were saved through daring rescues, leaving behind stories of courage and heartbreak that would be remembered for generations. Parents searched tirelessly for missing children, clinging to hope, despite the overwhelming destruction around them. Even in the face of such devastation, the people of New England displayed remarkable determination. For every account of loss and suffering, there were also stories of survival and solidarity. Families who had lost everything found solace in the kindness of strangers, as communities rallied together to provide food, clothing, and shelter. The storm, while leaving a trail of destruction, also revealed the strength of human connection in times of crisis. As the storm subsided, the true scale of the disaster became evident. The devastation that the 1938 hurricane left in its wake reshaped New England, affecting not only the physical landscape, but also the region's collective psyche. The once familiar towns and cities were now ghostly remnants, their landscapes marred by the ruins of buildings, downed trees, and miles of debris-laden streets. Emergency response teams, local authorities, and volunteers scrambled to provide aid, but the task was daunting. The challenge was not just clearing roads or salvaging belongings, it was piecing together shattered lives. One of the most pressing concerns in the days after the hurricane was ensuring the safety and well-being of survivors. Makeshift shelters sprang up in schools, community centers, and churches. Medical personnel worked tirelessly to treat injuries, ranging from broken bones and deep lacerations to illnesses stemming from contaminated water. The disaster left thousands without homes, forcing many to take refuge in temporary housing while rebuilding efforts began in earnest. Communities, which had been torn apart, began to come together with an incredible display of unity, determined to rebuild their homes and lives. The financial costs of the hurricane were staggering. In the immediate aftermath, Estimates put the total damage at around $400 million, a figure equivalent to several billion dollars today. The storm's economic impact was not limited to property damage. It was felt throughout New England's industries. Fishing, shipping, and trade were particularly hard hit, contributing to the already dire economic climate of the Great Depression. The storm underscored the vulnerability of the region's infrastructure and brought attention to the urgent need for improvements to withstand future catastrophes. This catastrophe ultimately spurred significant changes in how the United States approached weather forecasting and disaster preparedness. The Great New England Hurricane was a wake-up call that underscored the limitations of meteorological technology of the time. Before this event, weather forecasting was rudimentary at best, with limited tools and data for tracking storms. The 1938 hurricane led to advancements in this field, laying the groundwork for modern forecasting. While the storm had taken the country by surprise, it served as a catalyst for improvements such as the establishment of the National Weather Service, which would eventually employ more sophisticated radar systems and computer models to predict the path and intensity of hurricanes with greater accuracy. Infrastructure development was also a significant outcome of the hurricane's aftermath. Coastal areas that had once been vulnerable to the forces of nature saw the construction of seawalls, stronger flood barriers, and improved building codes. These measures were intended to protect both human lives and property from future disasters. The storm left New England with a lasting legacy of resilience, a reminder that in the face of nature's immense power, preparation and unity are the keys to survival. The memory of the 1938 hurricane continues to hold a place in New England's collective consciousness. Annual hurricane preparedness drills, community education, and awareness campaigns have all been influenced by the lessons learned from that fateful September day. Families who lived through it passed down stories of survival and loss, ensuring that the impact of the storm was never forgotten. For generations, the event has been seen as both a tragedy and a triumph of human spirit, a chapter in the history of the region that speaks to the importance of respect for the forces of nature, community solidarity, and the never-ending work of rebuilding and fortifying in the wake of disaster. As we reflect on the legacy of the Great New England Hurricane, it becomes clear that while nature can be merciless, the courage and resilience of those who face such challenges can be inspiring. The storm's wrath might have left deep scars, but the response to it paved the way for a safer, more prepared future. And so this storm is not just a story of loss, it is also a testament to the strength of the people who lived through it and the lessons learned that continue to shape how we prepare for the unexpected. Hurricane Wilma began as a relatively small weather disturbance in the Caribbean Sea in October 2005, but what started as a cluster of thunderstorms would quickly evolve into one of the most intense hurricanes ever recorded in the Atlantic. The storm first formed as a tropical depression on October 15, 2005, southeast of Jamaica, where warm sea surface temperatures and favorable atmospheric conditions fueled its rapid development. Over the next few days, Wilma strengthened into a tropical storm, and by October 18th, it had reached hurricane status. The storm's intensification was nothing short of astonishing. Meteorologists closely monitored Wilma as it rapidly intensified into a Category 5 hurricane within just 24 hours, a phenomenon that stunned experts. By October 19th, Wilma's central pressure plummeted to 882 millibars, making it the most intense hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin at that time. With sustained winds of 185 miles per hour, the storm's eye wall became tightly organized, and its eye shrank to just 2 miles in diameter, creating a pinhole eye that is characteristic of the most intense hurricanes. As Wilma reached its peak intensity, it became clear that the storm was a force of nature unlike anything seen before. The hurricane's path remained unpredictable at first, as it meandered slowly over the Caribbean Sea. This created widespread uncertainty for residents across the region, who anxiously waited to see where the storm would strike next. While some hoped the storm would weaken before making landfall, Wilma's sheer strength made it one of the most threatening hurricanes of the 2005 season, a year that was already notorious for deadly storms like Katrina and Rita. After days of uncertainty, Hurricane Wilma began to move northwest, setting its sights on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula as the storm approached. Officials in the region issued urgent warnings for residents to evacuate, especially in the popular tourist destinations of Cancun, Cozumel, and Playa del Carmen. Despite these warnings, many locals and tourists found themselves trapped as the storm arrived sooner than expected. On October 21st, Wilma made its first devastating landfall as a Category 4 hurricane near Cozumel. The Yucatan Peninsula bore the brunt of Wilma's fury for over 48 hours as the storm stalled over the region, moving at an agonizingly slow pace. This prolonged the destruction as the hurricane's powerful winds and torrential rains battered the area. Winds of over 150 miles per hour uprooted trees, destroyed buildings, and left entire neighborhoods submerged in floodwaters. The storm surge along the coast swallowed beaches and inundated coastal properties, leaving behind a trail of devastation that would take months, if not years, to repair. In Cancun, the once bustling hotel zone was reduced to a wasteland of shattered glass, debris, and ruined infrastructure. The iconic beaches that attracted millions of tourists each year were eroded, and many hotels were forced to close indefinitely. Inland areas were also not spared, as Wilma's heavy rainfall led to widespread flooding, cutting off communities and causing rivers to overflow. Residents were left without power or clean drinking water for days, and rescue operations were hampered by the widespread destruction. The death toll in Mexico, though relatively low compared to other major hurricanes, was a testament to the storm's immense power and the swift response from local authorities who managed to evacuate many residents before the worst of the storm hit. After wreaking havoc on the Yucatan Peninsula, Hurricane Wilma finally began to move northward across the Gulf of Mexico, but the storm was far from over. As it moved over the warm waters of the Gulf, Wilma began to reorganize, regaining strength after weakening slightly during its prolonged stay over land. Meteorologists closely tracked the storm's progress, noting that it could potentially intensify again before making a second landfall in the United States. By October 23rd, Wilma had regained Category 3 status, with maximum sustained winds of around 115 miles per hour, making it a formidable threat to the U.S. Gulf Coast. Forecasters predicted that the storm would take aim at Florida, particularly the southern part of the state, where residents were already preparing for the worst. Mandatory evacuation orders were issued for low-lying coastal areas, and millions of people scrambled to secure their homes, stock up on supplies, or leave the state entirely. Florida was no stranger to hurricanes, but the sheer unpredictability of Wilma's path, combined with the fact that the 2005 hurricane season had already been so deadly, left many residents feeling anxious and uncertain about what was to come. As Wilma approached, Florida Governor Jeb Bush urged residents to take the storm seriously, emphasizing the potential for significant damage. By October 24th, Wilma made its second landfall near Cape Romano, Florida, as a Category 3 hurricane. The storm tore through the southern part of the state, bringing with it destructive winds, heavy rainfall, and a dangerous storm surge. Even though the hurricane's intensity had decreased slightly, it still caused widespread damage across Florida, especially in densely populated areas like Naples, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami. Hurricane Wilma's impact on Florida was both swift and severe. As the storm made its way across the state, it brought down power lines, uprooted trees, and damaged thousands of homes and businesses. Winds of up to 120 miles per hour ripped off roofs, shattered windows, and left entire communities without power for weeks. In the Miami metropolitan area, high-rise buildings were particularly vulnerable, with many experiencing broken windows and structural damage. Streets were littered with debris, making travel nearly impossible in the immediate aftermath of the storm. One of the most significant challenges in the wake of Wilma was the widespread power outages. Over 6 million people were left without electricity, and many regions struggled to restore power for weeks after the storm had passed. In some areas, residents faced long lines at gas stations, grocery stores, and supply centers as they tried to gather the resources they needed to survive. The damage to infrastructure was immense, with roads washed out, bridges damaged, and water systems disrupted. Hospitals and emergency services were overwhelmed, particularly in South Florida, where the storm had hit the hardest. Despite the destruction, Florida's residents showed resilience in the face of disaster. Neighbors helped each other clear debris, and local authorities worked tirelessly to restore order and get essential services back up and running. However, the financial toll was staggering, with early estimates suggesting that Wilma caused billions of dollars in damage. For many Floridians, The storm's aftermath was a long and difficult recovery process, with some areas taking years to fully rebuild. In the days and weeks following Hurricane Wilma, the focus shifted to recovery and rebuilding. Federal, state, and local agencies, along with volunteers from across the country, worked to provide aid to the hardest hit areas. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, played a significant role in coordinating disaster relief efforts, providing temporary housing, food, and financial assistance to those affected by the storm. However, the scale of the damage meant that recovery was slow and uneven, with some communities, particularly in rural areas, struggling to access the help they needed. The agricultural sector in Florida was particularly hard hit by Wilma, with citrus groves and sugarcane fields experiencing extensive damage. This had a ripple effect on the state's economy, as the agricultural industry was a major contributor to Florida's overall financial health. Farmers faced months of uncertainty as they worked to salvage what they could from their crops and rebuild their livelihoods. Wilma also had a lasting impact on hurricane preparedness in the United States. The storm served as a stark reminder of the importance of early evacuation orders and the need for more robust infrastructure capable of withstanding such powerful storms. In the years following Wilma, Florida and other hurricane-prone states invested heavily in improving their emergency response systems, reinforcing buildings and educating the public about hurricane safety. As part of the historic 2005 hurricane season, which also included the infamous Hurricane Katrina, Wilma is remembered as one of the most intense and destructive storms to ever hit the Atlantic. Its legacy endures not only in the physical scars left on the regions it struck, but also in the collective memory of those who lived through it. For many, the experience of Hurricane Wilma was a sobering reminder of nature's destructive power and the importance of preparedness in the face of such deadly storms. In the early days of September 1900, the bustling coastal city of Galveston, Texas, was completely unaware of the devastation that was about to unfold. Known as the Wall Street of the Southwest, Galveston was one of the wealthiest and most important ports in the United States. The city's prime location on Galveston Island along the Gulf of Mexico had made it a hub of trade and commerce, and its population had grown rapidly, reaching nearly 38,000 by 1900. However, this prosperity came with a dangerous sense of complacency. The city had weathered numerous storms in the past, and the residents believed that they would easily survive any future storms. Even Isaac Klein, the head of the Weather Bureau's Galveston office, famously wrote in an 1891 article that it would be impossible for a hurricane of significant strength to strike the island. But all of that changed on September 8, 1900, when the Great Galveston Hurricane made landfall. This storm, later known as the deadliest natural disaster in United States history, would go on to claim the lives of an estimated 8,000 people, with some reports suggesting that the number could be as high as 12,000. The city of Galveston was devastated, with nearly every building suffering damage and thousands of homes destroyed. In a matter of hours, the thriving city was reduced to ruins, and the lives of countless families were forever altered. The 1900 Galveston hurricane wasn't just a local disaster, it was a tragedy of epic proportions that had a profound impact on the entire nation. The storm ended Galveston's golden era as potential investors turned to nearby Houston, fearful of future hurricanes. In the wake of the storm, significant changes were made, including the construction of a seawall to protect the city and the raising of the island itself. This introduction sets the stage for a closer look at how this catastrophic event unfolded, starting with the formation of the storm and the initial signs that something was amiss. In the next part, we'll explore how the hurricane developed and the preparations, or lack thereof, that were made as the storm approached the Texas coast. The 1900 Galveston Hurricane began its deadly journey as a tropical storm in the far eastern Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of West Africa in late August. At the time, meteorology was still a developing science, and the tools available to track and predict storms were rudimentary at best. Despite these limitations, weather observers noticed the formation of a storm system that appeared to be gaining strength as it moved westward across the warm waters of the Atlantic. By the end of the first week of September, the storm had intensified into a full-fledged hurricane, although its exact path remained uncertain. In those days, the United States Weather Bureau, which later became the National Weather Service, relied heavily on reports from ships at sea and limited land-based observations. Communication between different regions was slow, and information about the storm was often outdated by the time it reached the public. As the hurricane approached the Caribbean, it made its first significant landfall in Cuba on September 6th. The storm caused considerable damage but did not lead to widespread alarm in the United States. Unfortunately, the Cuban meteorologists' warnings about the storm's potential severity were largely dismissed by their American counterparts. The Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C. predicted that the storm would veer northeastward and spare the Gulf Coast. They did not realize that the hurricane was about to take a more dangerous course. On September 7th, the storm entered the Gulf of Mexico, where it encountered ideal conditions for further intensification. The waters of the Gulf were exceptionally warm, providing the energy needed for the hurricane to strengthen rapidly. By now, it was clear that the storm was heading toward the Texas coast, but the residents of Galveston remained largely unaware of the impending danger. Isaac Klein, the head of the Weather Bureau's Galveston office, had noticed some concerning signs. The Gulf waters were rising, the wind was picking up, and the barometric pressure was dropping, a clear indication that a powerful storm was approaching. However, like many others, Klein did not believe that a hurricane of great strength could strike Galveston. He assured the public that there was no cause for alarm, even as the signs of an approaching storm became more ominous. By the evening of September 7th, the weather in Galveston had begun to deteriorate rapidly. Heavy rain and strong winds battered the city, but most residents believed it was just another typical Gulf storm. Some even ventured out to the beaches to watch the waves crash against the shore, unaware that within hours those very waves would rise up and engulf their city. As night fell, the storm continued to intensify and the fate of Galveston was sealed. The lack of preparation and the underestimation of the storm's severity would prove to be catastrophic. In the next part, we will delve into the day of the hurricane, when the full force of the storm struck the city, bringing with it unimaginable destruction and loss of life. On the morning of September 8, 1900, the residents of Galveston awoke to a scene that was already foreboding. The winds had grown stronger overnight, whipping through the streets with increasing ferocity. The sky was a heavy, ominous gray, and the usually calm waters of the Gulf had transformed into a raging, turbulent mass. By mid-morning, the situation had become more alarming, as the winds reached hurricane force and the tide began to surge. Despite the growing danger, many in Galveston remained unaware of the severity of the storm that was about to engulf their city. Some, who lived in more vulnerable areas near the coast, had begun to move to higher ground, or to the homes of friends and family. Others, however, believed the storm would pass without significant incident, as so many storms had before. The lack of an official evacuation order or any clear warning only added to the sense of false security. By midday, the full force of the hurricane had arrived. The winds, now exceeding 100 miles per hour, tore through the city, ripping roofs off houses, toppling trees, and turning loose debris into deadly projectiles. The storm surge, a massive wall of water pushed ashore by the power of the hurricane, began to inundate the island. Water levels rose rapidly, flooding streets, homes, and businesses. The low-lying areas of Galveston were quickly submerged, and the floodwaters continued to rise with alarming speed. The waves, driven by the relentless winds, battered the seawall-less island with incredible force. Entire neighborhoods were swept away as houses, unable to withstand the surge, collapsed and were carried off by the floodwaters. People who had sought refuge in their homes found themselves trapped by the rising water, with few options for escape. Panic set in as the reality of the situation became clear. This was not just a severe storm, it was a catastrophic hurricane unlike anything Galveston had ever experienced. As the day wore on, the situation grew increasingly dire. The winds continued to strengthen, now reaching their peak at over 130 miles per hour. The storm's surge rose higher, swallowing more of the city and leaving only the tallest buildings and structures above water. Many sought refuge in the few large buildings that remained standing. But even these were not immune to the storm's wrath. The sounds of crashing waves, howling winds, and the destruction of buildings filled the air, creating a terrifying cacophony. The city's communication with the outside world had been cut off, leaving those in Galveston isolated and without any way to call for help. The Weather Bureau had no way of knowing the true extent of the disaster unfolding on the island, and the residents could only rely on their instincts to survive. Some attempted to flee to higher ground, while others clung to whatever they could find, hoping to ride out the storm. By nightfall, the hurricane's fury showed no signs of abating. The floodwaters continued to rise, and the winds, though beginning to taper slightly, were still devastating. The once vibrant city of Galveston was now a scene of utter devastation. Entire neighborhoods had been wiped out, and countless lives were in peril. The destruction was so widespread that it was difficult to comprehend the full scale of the disaster. As the storm finally began to move inland and lose strength, the people of Galveston were left to face the horrifying aftermath. In the next part, we will explore the aftermath of the hurricane, the devastating loss of life, and the heroic efforts of those who survived to help rebuild their shattered city. As the winds finally subsided and the floodwaters began to recede, the true extent of the devastation in Galveston became horrifyingly clear. The city, once a bustling hub of commerce and culture, now lay in ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been obliterated, reduced to little more than piles of debris. The elegant mansions that lined the coast, the bustling downtown businesses, and the modest homes of working families were all gone, swallowed by the storm and the sea. Survivors emerged from their makeshift shelters to find a landscape that was almost unrecognizable. Streets were buried under mountains of wreckage, with shattered timbers, broken glass, and twisted metal strewn everywhere. The floodwaters, which had risen as much as 15 feet in some places, had left behind a thick layer of mud and silt, further complicating the already overwhelming task of recovery. The air was thick with the stench of salt water, mud, and decay, and the eerie silence that followed the storm was punctuated only by the sounds of people searching for loved ones and beginning the grim task of collecting the dead. The loss of life was staggering. Estimates of the death toll vary, but it is widely believed that between 6,000 and 12,000 people perished in the hurricane, making it the deadliest natural disaster in United States history. Bodies were found everywhere, trapped in the wreckage of their homes, washed up on the shore, or buried under debris. The sheer number of dead overwhelmed the city's ability to deal with them, and many were buried in mass graves or simply lost to the sea. The survivors, many of whom had lost everything, were left to grieve in the midst of unimaginable destruction. The city's infrastructure was in shambles. The water supply was contaminated by salt water and debris, making it unsafe to drink. The telegraph and telephone lines, which had once connected Galveston to the outside world, were down, leaving the city isolated and without a means to call for help. The railroad bridges that connected the island to the mainland had been destroyed, cutting off any possibility of bringing in supplies or evacuating the wounded and displaced. In the absence of any formal communication, rumors and fear spread quickly among the survivors, adding to the sense of chaos and despair. Despite the overwhelming devastation, the people of Galveston did not give up. In the days following the hurricane, a massive and heroic recovery effort began. Those who had survived the storm immediately set to work, clearing debris, searching for survivors, and caring for the wounded. Makeshift hospitals were established in the few buildings that remained standing, and volunteers worked tirelessly to provide food, water, and shelter to those who had lost everything. Word of the disaster slowly began to reach the mainland, and help soon arrived. Relief efforts were organized, and supplies began to trickle in by boat, the only means of access to the island. The U.S. Army was dispatched to assist with the recovery, and volunteers from across the country came to Galveston to help with the monumental task of rebuilding. The city's residents, though devastated by their losses, showed remarkable resilience and determination as they began to piece their lives back together. The rebuilding process was slow and fraught with challenges. With so much of the city destroyed, there was a shortage of materials and labor, and the work was often dangerous. Many of the buildings that had survived the storm were damaged beyond repair and had to be demolished, further adding to the sense of loss. But despite these difficulties, the people of Galveston pressed on, driven by a desire to rebuild their city and honor the memory of those who had been lost. In the final part, we will explore how Galveston rose from the ashes of this disaster, the lessons learned from the hurricane, and the lasting impact it had on the city and its people. In the aftermath of the hurricane, Galveston faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding a city nearly wiped off the map. The task was daunting, but the people of Galveston were determined to restore their home. The process began with clearing the massive amounts of debris that littered the island. This was no small feat, as the storm had left behind mountains of rubble, tangled with remnants of homes, businesses, and lives that had been lost. Volunteers, military personnel, and the remaining residents worked tirelessly to clear the streets and begin the long process of reconstruction. Now, one of the most significant and ambitious projects undertaken was the razing of the entire city. Engineers proposed elevating Galveston to protect it from future storms, a project that was both unprecedented and monumental in scope. Buildings were jacked up, sometimes as much as 17 feet, and sand and dirt were pumped in to fill the space below. Streets were raised, and a new seawall stretching more than 10 miles was constructed to shield the island from future storm surges. This engineering marvel not only transformed the landscape of Galveston, but also demonstrated the city's resilience and commitment to surviving in a perilous environment. The economic impact of the hurricane was profound. Before the storm, Galveston had been a major port and one of the wealthiest cities in Texas, known for its vibrant culture and booming economy. The hurricane, however, shifted that prosperity to nearby Houston, which emerged as the region's new economic powerhouse. Despite this shift, Galveston remained an important city, continuing to thrive in new ways. Tourism became a significant industry as visitors flocked to see the seawall and the city's ongoing recovery efforts. The storm also had a lasting impact on disaster preparedness and response. The 1900 Galveston Hurricane is often cited as a pivotal moment in the development of modern meteorology and emergency management. The scale of the disaster highlighted the need for better forecasting, communication, and evacuation planning. Lessons learned from Galveston influenced policies and procedures that would be implemented in future disasters, helping to save countless lives in the years to come. Galveston's recovery was not just about rebuilding structures, it was about healing a community that had been deeply scarred by tragedy. The loss of thousands of lives left a permanent mark on the city's collective memory, and the stories of those who perished became a part of Galveston's history. Memorials were erected and annual commemorations were held to honor the victims and to remind future generations of the city's resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. Today, Galveston stands as a testament to the strength and determination of its people. The city has evolved, but it has never forgotten the lessons of the past. The seawall, the raised buildings, and the memorials are enduring symbols of the city's commitment to protecting its future while honoring its history. Galveston's story is one of survival, resilience, and rebirth, a powerful reminder that even in the face of overwhelming disaster, a community can rise again, stronger and more determined than ever. The 1900 Galveston Hurricane remains the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history, but it also serves as a story of hope and recovery. Galveston's ability to rebuild and adapt has inspired countless others, proving that even the most devastating tragedies can lead to renewal and growth. The city's legacy continues to live on, not only in the physical structures that were rebuilt, but also in the spirit of its people, who faced one of nature's fiercest storms and emerged with a renewed sense of purpose and resilience. Hurricane Fifi was a devastating natural disaster that hit Central America, especially Honduras, in September 1974. It originated as a tropical wave off the coast of Africa on September 8th, slowly developing as it moved across the Atlantic Ocean. By September 14th, it had turned into a tropical depression near Haiti. Over the next few days, Fifi gained strength, eventually becoming a powerful hurricane. This storm struck several countries along its path, but Honduras experienced the worst of its destruction. When Fifi made landfall on September 18th, it brought with it massive rainfall, intense winds, and severe flooding. Honduras was unprepared for the level of devastation it caused. Entire towns and villages were swept away, and the storm's impact on the country was catastrophic. In total, Fifi claimed the lives of thousands of people and left tens of thousands homeless. It stands as one of the deadliest hurricanes in history, a tragedy that forever changed the regions it affected. Hurricane Fifi's formation began as a tropical wave that emerged off the coast of West Africa on September 8, 1974. As this system traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, conditions allowed it to gradually intensify. By September 14th, it had developed into a tropical depression near the Caribbean, just east of Haiti. Warm ocean temperatures and favorable atmospheric conditions contributed to its rapid growth, transforming it into a tropical storm within a day. By September 16th, Fifi reached hurricane strength as it moved through the Caribbean Sea. Early warnings were issued, but many of the areas in its path, especially in Central America, had limited resources for proper preparation. Fifi brought strong winds and heavy rain as it swept over the northern coast of Honduras and other neighboring countries, although it didn't directly hit larger nations like Cuba or the Dominican Republic. The storm caused flooding and minor damage in these regions. Despite its early stages being somewhat less destructive than anticipated, the true impact of Hurricane Fifi became evident as it approached Central America. The combination of its increasing strength and the region's mountainous terrain meant that the storm's rains would soon lead to catastrophic flooding. With the storm gaining momentum, people in Honduras, Guatemala, and other nearby countries began to brace for what was coming. As Hurricane Fifi made landfall in Honduras on September 18, 1974, its true devastation began to unfold. The storm slammed into the northern coast of the country, unleashing torrential rains, powerful winds, and destructive storm surges. Coastal towns and villages were the first to be hit, with homes and infrastructure completely destroyed by the hurricane's intensity. Winds reached up to 110 km/h, tearing apart buildings and uprooting trees as the storm continued inland. However, it was the catastrophic flooding that caused the most widespread damage. The mountainous terrain of Honduras and neighboring Guatemala amplified the storm's effects as the heavy rains turned rivers into torrents, triggering landslides and flash floods. Entire villages were submerged, and many people were caught off guard by the speed at which the water levels rose. Roads, bridges, and communication lines were washed away, leaving communities completely isolated. In the wake of the storm, thousands of people were left homeless, and the death toll began to rise as rescue efforts were hindered by the destruction. Rivers overflowed, and fertile farmlands were wiped out, threatening food supplies in the already impoverished region. While Honduras bore the brunt of Fifi's wrath, other Central American countries like Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Belize also suffered severe flooding and damage. In the aftermath of Hurricane Fifi, the scale of devastation became even more apparent. Entire communities were wiped out, and the death toll soared, with estimates suggesting that up to 8,000 people lost their lives. Thousands more were missing or injured, and the number of displaced families was staggering. With homes, infrastructure, and farmland destroyed, the region faced an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. Efforts to provide aid were slow and complicated by the destruction of roads and communication networks. Helicopters and boats were used to reach isolated villages, delivering food, water, and medical supplies. International aid poured in, with countries and organizations offering support in the form of financial donations, medical teams, and emergency supplies. However, the scale of the disaster overwhelmed local and international efforts as the region struggled to cope with the immediate needs of survivors. The economic impact was equally severe. Agriculture, a vital part of the economy in Honduras and neighboring countries, was decimated by the floods. Crops were washed away, livestock drowned, and entire plantations were ruined, threatening food security for months to come. The cost of rebuilding homes, roads, and other infrastructure was astronomical, setting the region back by years in terms of development. The people of Honduras and other affected areas were left to grapple with the long-term consequences of Fifi as the rebuilding process began slowly and the emotional toll of the disaster weighed heavily on the survivors. Hurricane Fifi left a profound mark on Honduras and the surrounding region, with its devastating aftermath affecting the area for years to come. The storm highlighted the vulnerabilities of countries with limited infrastructure and resources to handle such natural disasters. Though international aid played a crucial role in the initial recovery efforts, the long-term rebuilding process was slow and challenging. Many survivors were left to rebuild their lives with little support, and entire communities had to be relocated to safer areas due to the extensive damage. In the years following the hurricane, steps were taken to improve disaster preparedness in Central America. Governments in the region began to focus more on creating better warning systems, strengthening infrastructure, and developing disaster response plans to prevent such widespread devastation in the future. However, the economic and social recovery was slow, with many families continuing to feel the ripple effects of Fifi's destruction for decades. The legacy of Hurricane Fifi serves as a reminder of the power of nature and the importance of preparedness in the face of such catastrophic events. The storm's lasting impact not only reshaped the physical landscape of Honduras, but also the lives of its people, leaving behind stories of survival, loss, and resilience. In October 1998, Hurricane Mitch struck Central America, leaving a trail of destruction and heartache. This hurricane may not have been as famous as others in the United States, but its impact was devastating. The storm originated in the Caribbean Sea, gaining strength and momentum as it approached the coast of Honduras. While hurricanes are common in this region, Mitch was different. This hurricane became the second deadliest on record, claiming approximately 11,000 lives and causing widespread destruction across Honduras and Nicaragua. The disaster not only took lives, but also left countless people homeless, erasing decades of progress in these countries. Hurricane Mitch's journey began when a tropical wave moved off the coast of Africa on October 10th. It traveled across the Atlantic and eventually formed into Tropical Depression 13 on October 22nd over the southwestern Caribbean Sea. This storm initially seemed to be heading toward the Yucatan Peninsula, but shifted directions unexpectedly, making its way toward Honduras. The hurricane took its time, pausing for 2 days over Honduras and unleashing relentless rainfall that would have catastrophic effects. In the end, Mitch became more than just a storm. It was a natural disaster that tested the resilience of communities and governments in Central America. Hurricane Mitch formed due to a combination of factors that created favorable conditions for a tropical storm. After developing into Tropical Storm Mitch on October 23rd, it quickly intensified. As the storm moved slowly northward, it encountered warm waters and good outflow, which allowed it to strengthen into a hurricane on October 24th. By October 25th, Mitch became a major hurricane, and just a day later, it was classified as a Category 5 hurricane, with maximum sustained winds reaching 180 miles per hour. As the hurricane approached, governments across Central America sprang into action. The Honduran government evacuated about 100,000 people from vulnerable coastal areas, especially from the Bay Islands. Belize issued a purple alert, urging citizens in offshore islands to seek safety on the mainland. Guatemala also prepared for the storm, warning residents to stay in port and seek shelter. Many people heeded these warnings, evacuating to safer locations. Despite these precautions, the sheer size and intensity of Mitch would soon overwhelm these efforts. As October 29th approached, residents braced for impact, unaware of the devastation that awaited them. On October 29th, Hurricane Mitch made landfall in Honduras, with winds of 80 miles per hour. However, the storm's most damaging feature was not just its winds, but the torrential rain that it brought. For 2 days, Mitch poured down rain at an astonishing rate, sometimes up to 4 inches an hour. The slow-moving storm caused rivers to overflow and landslides to sweep across the mountainous regions. The effects were catastrophic. Many people lost their homes to flooding and mudslides, while roads and infrastructure were destroyed. During this time, reports of the disaster flooded in from various areas. In Honduras, entire communities were submerged and many people became trapped in their homes. The situation in Nicaragua was no less dire. One mudslide alone claimed the lives of 2,000 individuals. The destruction was overwhelming, and in the days that followed, the death toll climbed steadily. By the time the storm began to lose its strength, the damage was already immense, with estimates of over $5 billion in losses. The disaster's impact would be felt for years, affecting countless lives and changing the landscape of the region forever. After Hurricane Mitch passed, the landscape of Central America was forever altered. The natural environment bore the brunt of the storm's fury. Rivers that once flowed calmly became raging torrents, causing unprecedented flooding. In some areas, rainfall totals reached 36 inches, leading to massive mudslides that buried homes and communities. The flora and fauna suffered immensely. The hurricane uprooted trees and destroyed vast areas of vegetation, particularly in Honduras. One island, Guanaja, was left almost entirely barren, as winds exceeding 125 miles per hour tore through it. The aftermath of the hurricane was marked not only by physical destruction, but also by a humanitarian crisis. Many people lost their homes, livelihoods, and loved ones. In addition to the immediate destruction, the storm also brought about outbreaks of diseases such as cholera, leptospirosis, and dengue fever. The lack of clean water and adequate shelter allowed these diseases to spread rapidly, further compounding the tragedy. The people of Central America faced an uphill battle to recover from the devastation. Hurricane Mitch is remembered as one of the deadliest and most destructive hurricanes in history, leaving a lasting impact on Central America. The storm destroyed decades of progress in Honduras and Nicaragua, with President Carlos Roberto Flores stating that it wiped out 50 years of development in Honduras alone. Countries around the world responded with aid, contributing a staggering $6 billion to assist in recovery efforts. This funding was crucial for rebuilding infrastructure and supporting communities in need. In the years that followed, the effects of Hurricane Mitch remained evident. Many people were forced to rebuild their lives from scratch, while some took the opportunity to construct stronger, more resilient homes. The economic situation in the region remained fragile. The loss of agricultural land and livelihoods pushed many families into poverty. Hurricane Mitch served as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by communities in the path of natural disasters. The storm not only claimed lives, but also reshaped the future of the region, prompting governments to take measures to improve disaster preparedness and response in hopes of preventing such a catastrophe from occurring again. Hurricane Gilbert was one of the most destructive and intense hurricanes ever recorded in the Atlantic. In fact, when it hit in 1988, it was considered the most powerful hurricane in the Atlantic basin in terms of barometric pressure, a record that stood until 2005 when Hurricane Wilma surpassed it. Gilbert formed during the 1988 Atlantic hurricane season, which had already been active. However, no one expected the level of devastation this storm would bring. The story of Hurricane Gilbert starts in early September 1988. It began as a tropical wave off the northwestern coast of Africa, like many Atlantic hurricanes do. As it crossed the Atlantic, it gradually gained strength, eventually growing into a massive Category 5 hurricane, the most powerful on the Saffir-Simpson scale. At its peak, it had sustained winds of 185 miles per hour, and its massive wind field stretched up to 575 miles in diameter, making it one of the largest hurricanes ever observed in the Atlantic. Gilbert first made landfall in Jamaica on September 12, 1988. Before continuing its path of destruction through the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, the storm's sheer size and strength made it one of the most dangerous and costly hurricanes in history, leaving a path of devastation in its wake. Entire regions were flattened, thousands of homes were destroyed, and it led to the deaths of over 400 people. The storm caused approximately $3 billion in damage, and its name was retired forever due to its catastrophic impact. In the aftermath, Hurricane Gilbert left an indelible mark on the Caribbean, Mexico, and the Gulf Coast. Its widespread destruction to communities, lives, and economies made it a defining moment for the Atlantic hurricane season of 1988. This storm was one of the worst natural disasters of the time, and it took years for many affected regions to fully recover. To understand the full scope of this devastating event, we need to look at how it all began and how it grew into the monster storm that it became. Hurricane Gilbert's origins can be traced back to a tropical wave, a low-pressure system moving from east to west, that moved off the coast of Africa on September 3, 1988. For several days, this wave traveled across the Atlantic, remaining relatively disorganized. However, on September 8th, satellite images revealed that the system was starting to develop a well-defined circulation center. At this point, it was located roughly 400 miles east of Barbados, and meteorologists began to take notice. By the next day, the National Hurricane Center, NHC, classified it as a tropical depression, the 12th of the season. As the tropical depression moved west-northwestward, it encountered favorable conditions for strengthening: warm ocean waters and low wind shear. On September 9th, the depression intensified into Tropical Storm Gilbert. Over the next few days, it steadily gained strength as it passed through the Lesser Antilles, bringing high winds and heavy rains to the islands. By late on September 10th, Gilbert had intensified into a hurricane as it moved south of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. By this time, warnings were being issued across the Caribbean. Gilbert's rapid intensification continued. On September 11th, it became a Category 3 major hurricane, with winds of 125 miles per hour. It was clear that this was no ordinary storm, and preparations were ramping up across the Caribbean. In Jamaica, hurricane warnings were issued, and residents were urged to evacuate coastal areas and prepare for the worst. Schools, businesses, and government offices were closed, and thousands of people sought shelter. Airlines canceled flights to and from the region, and in the Cayman Islands, residents were evacuated by Cayman Airways as the storm barreled toward them. Across the region, people were bracing for a potentially catastrophic event. Despite these preparations, many did not fully realize the scale of the disaster they were about to face. On September 12th, Gilbert made landfall on Jamaica as a Category 3 hurricane. It was the first major hurricane to hit the island directly in over 30 years. The storm's 15-mile-wide eye passed directly over the island, battering it with torrential rains and devastating winds. But this was just the beginning, as Gilbert was about to grow even stronger as it moved back over open waters. Hurricane Gilbert's most destructive phase began after it made landfall in Jamaica on September 12, 1988. While Jamaica bore the brunt of the storm initially, This was only the start of Gilbert's deadly path through the Caribbean and beyond. After devastating Jamaica, the storm moved westward into the warm waters of the Caribbean Sea, where it rapidly intensified. Within hours, Gilbert had reached Category 5 intensity, the highest possible rating on the Saffir-Simpson scale. By September 13th, Gilbert had become a monster storm with sustained winds of 185 miles per hour, and its central pressure had dropped to 888 millibars, making it the most intense hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic up until that time. As Gilbert approached Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, its massive size and strength became even more apparent. Tropical storm force winds extended outward for 575 miles from the storm's center, making it one of the largest Atlantic hurricanes ever observed. The Yucatan Peninsula was directly in Gilbert's path, and on September 14th, the storm made landfall near the island of Cozumel. At landfall, Gilbert was still a Category 5 hurricane, with winds of 165 miles per hour. The impact on the region was catastrophic. Entire communities were flattened by the powerful winds, and a massive storm surge inundated coastal areas. The popular tourist destination of Cancun saw 60% of its beaches washed away, and inland flooding extended up to 3 miles. In addition to the wind and surge, Gilbert dumped over 13 inches of rain in some parts of the Yucatan Peninsula, causing flash flooding and landslides. More than 60,000 homes were destroyed, leaving tens of thousands of people homeless. Over 80 ships sank during the storm, and many areas were completely cut off due to the damage. But Gilbert wasn't finished yet. After crossing the Yucatan, the storm weakened slightly over land, but as it moved into the Gulf of Mexico on September 15th, it began to strengthen again. By the time it made landfall in mainland Mexico on September 16th, it was a Category 3 hurricane, packing winds of 125 miles per hour. The storm moved inland, lashing the city of Monterey with heavy rain and high winds, causing widespread flooding and killing over 150 people. In total, Gilbert was responsible for killing over 430 people across the Caribbean, Mexico, and the Gulf Coast, making it one of the deadliest storms of the 20th century. But the destruction didn't end with its landfall in Mexico. The storm's remnants continued to wreak havoc as it moved north into Texas, bringing tornadoes, flooding, and additional damage. The destruction caused by Hurricane Gilbert was truly staggering. Across the Caribbean, Mexico, and parts of the United States, the storm left behind a trail of devastation that took years to recover from. In total, the storm caused nearly $3 billion in damage, making it one of the most costly hurricanes in history at the time. In Jamaica, where the storm made its first landfall, the damage was extensive. Entire communities were flattened, and many homes and businesses were destroyed. The storm left over $700 million in damage on the island, and it took years for the country to fully recover. The powerful winds and heavy rains caused widespread flooding and landslides, particularly in mountainous areas, and the island's agricultural sector was hit hard, with crops like bananas and sugarcane being wiped out. In Mexico, the impact was even more severe. The Yucatan Peninsula, particularly the coastal areas of Cancun and Cozumel, was hit hardest by Gilbert's ferocious winds and storm surge. Entire stretches of coastline were washed away, and many tourist areas were left in ruins. In the days following the storm, more than 5,000 American tourists were evacuated from Cancun, as the city's infrastructure was in tatters. The inland city of Monterey also faced devastating flooding, as rivers overflowed their banks, washing away homes, vehicles, and even entire buses filled with people. More than 150 people were killed in Monterey alone, many of them swept away by the raging floodwaters. Across northern Mexico, heavy rainfall caused rivers to swell and landslides to occur, leaving many areas cut off from rescue efforts. Even the United States felt the effects of Hurricane Gilbert. Though Texas narrowly avoided a direct hit, the storm's outer bands spawned tornadoes across the state, causing additional damage. Nearly 30 tornadoes were recorded in Texas, including several that caused significant destruction in the San Antonio area. The storm also caused widespread beach erosion along the Gulf Coast, though the damage in the U.S. was relatively minor compared to the destruction in the Caribbean and Mexico. In total, more than 35,000 people were left homeless by the storm, and many areas struggled to rebuild in the aftermath. The sheer scale of the destruction was unprecedented. and it took years for many of the affected regions to recover. The storm's name, Gilbert, was retired by the World Meteorological Organization in 1989 due to the extensive damage it caused, a decision made for storms that have a particularly devastating impact. Hurricane Gilbert was more than just a powerful storm. It was a catastrophic event that changed the lives of millions of people in its path. The storm's legacy is one of destruction, loss, and resilience as the affected regions work to rebuild in the years following the disaster. For Jamaica, Mexico, and the other areas hit by Gilbert, it was a sobering reminder of the power of nature and the vulnerability of coastal communities to hurricanes. One of the lasting impacts of Hurricane Gilbert was the widespread recognition of the need for better disaster preparedness and response in the Caribbean and Gulf Coast regions. In the years following the storm, many countries invested in improved forecasting and early warning systems, as well as stronger building codes and infrastructure designed to withstand hurricanes. In the scientific community, Gilbert's intensity and size provided valuable data that helped researchers better understand the behavior of Category 5 hurricanes. The storm's record-breaking low pressure and massive wind field were key factors in advancing our understanding of how hurricanes develop and intensify, especially in the warm waters of the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. Gilbert also had a profound impact on the economies of the regions it affected. In Jamaica, the storm caused extensive damage to the island's agricultural sector, particularly the banana and sugarcane industries, which took years to recover. In Mexico, the storm had a devastating impact on the tourism industry, particularly in Cancun and Cozumel. The region's economy, heavily reliant on tourism, was crippled as hotels and resorts were destroyed and thousands of tourists were evacuated in the aftermath of the storm. Despite the destruction, Hurricane Gilbert also highlighted the resilience of the people in its path. In the face of such overwhelming devastation, communities came together to rebuild and recover. In Jamaica, Mexico, and the Gulf Coast, people worked tirelessly to rebuild homes, businesses, and infrastructure in the years following the storm. Today, Gilbert remains a benchmark for other major hurricanes. Its legacy is still felt in the regions it affected, and its name is remembered as one of the most destructive storms in history. The lessons learned from Hurricane Gilbert have helped shape how we prepare for and respond to hurricanes today, ensuring that future storms, while still dangerous, will not catch us unprepared. Hurricane Helene, one of the deadliest storms to impact the United States in recent history, struck with unrelenting force in late September 2024. This powerful Category 4 hurricane made landfall in Florida's Big Bend region, a coastal area not typically accustomed to storms of this magnitude. Helene's arrival marked the strongest storm ever to strike this part of Florida, and was catastrophic in terms of both wind speed and storm surge, leaving a path of destruction across the southeastern United States. Initially, meteorologists noticed signs of potential tropical cyclone activity on September 17, 2024, when a disturbance formed in the western Caribbean Sea. This system rapidly intensified, influenced by the Central American Gyre, a broad area of low pressure, and the Madden-Julian Oscillation, which together created the perfect breeding ground for hurricane development. Within a few days, on September 23rd, the system gained enough organization to be designated Potential Tropical Cyclone 9. By the following day, the storm had strengthened into Tropical Storm Helene, gaining momentum as it traveled northward toward the Gulf of Mexico. Helene's intensification was swift. It reached hurricane status on September 25th as it entered the Gulf with ideal conditions for strengthening: minimal wind shear, high humidity, and sea surface temperatures exceeding 86 degrees Fahrenheit. These factors fueled the storm, allowing it to intensify quickly into a Category 4 hurricane by September 26th. The storm's enormous size also posed a unique threat. Meteorologists noted it was among the largest hurricanes in recent memory, exposing an extensive area to severe winds, rain, and the risk of tornadoes. As Helene approached Florida, evacuation orders were issued across counties in the Big Bend region and along the Gulf Coast, where storm surge was anticipated to be devastating. Unfortunately, due to the storm's rapid intensification, not all residents were able to leave in time. Helene's impact upon landfall was catastrophic, with winds over 130 miles per hour and storm surge flooding reaching unprecedented heights, inundating low-lying areas, uprooting trees, and cutting off entire neighborhoods. In the hours following landfall, Hurricane Helene continued its relentless path of destruction through the southeast, pushing inland with hurricane-force winds and torrential rains that left entire communities submerged. Although Helene's wind speeds slightly reduced as it moved inland, the storm's intensity remained formidable, sweeping through Georgia, South Carolina, and up through North Carolina, with powerful gusts and severe rainfall. This deluge caused widespread flooding that overwhelmed rivers and creeks across the region, with some areas receiving over 20 inches of rain within a short period. As the storm progressed, North Carolina and Tennessee saw some of the worst inland flooding, with rivers like the French Broad and the Little Tennessee overflowing their banks. Small towns and urban areas alike were transformed by flash floods, which destroyed homes and forced many residents to evacuate or seek shelter in emergency facilities. In Atlanta, the effects were also severe. City infrastructure suffered and highways were cut off due to sudden water accumulation, making it nearly impossible for rescue teams to reach certain neighborhoods. The flooding was compounded by multiple tornadoes spawned as the storm traveled further north. South Carolina and eastern Tennessee experienced these tornadoes in high frequency, leaving downed power lines, destroyed buildings, and debris strewn streets in their wake. In Virginia, floodwaters caused additional disruption, leading to landslides in mountainous areas that further hindered rescue efforts. As Hurricane Helene moved deeper inland, it continued to wreak havoc on power grids and vital infrastructure, leaving millions without electricity across multiple states. The massive storm, which had already brought extensive damage to the Gulf Coast, saw its size contribute to the severity of outages and infrastructure destruction even far from the coast. Transmission lines, utility poles, and power stations in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia took heavy damage from Helene's strong winds and sustained rainfall, rendering countless homes and businesses powerless. This disruption added an additional layer of hardship for communities already dealing with flooded roads, damaged properties, and scarce emergency resources. In addition to power outages, contaminated water supplies emerged as a significant concern for residents in the affected areas. In Florida, sewage systems overflowed, and storm surge combined with heavy rain led to water contamination. Similar contamination spread in Georgia and the Carolinas, where overwhelmed sewer systems and failing wastewater facilities created health risks for those exposed to polluted floodwaters. Emergency crews worked to distribute clean water to as many people as possible, but the sheer scale of the impacted areas created logistical challenges. Health officials warned of waterborne illnesses, and cases of skin infections and other flood-related ailments began to rise. Moreover, Florida's coastal cities, particularly Tampa Bay, faced significant challenges as the record-breaking storm surge began to recede. Roads were left littered with debris, sand, and mud, and many buildings sustained lasting damage. Cleanup crews mobilized to remove fallen trees, overturned vehicles, and wrecked property, yet the scale of the devastation slowed recovery efforts. In the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, communities across the southeastern United States began to grapple with the long road to recovery. The impact was especially pronounced in the hardest-hit areas like Florida's Big Bend region, where homes and businesses were left in ruins and essential services remained largely unavailable. As people returned to assess the damage, many found their properties either irreparably destroyed or requiring extensive repairs. In coastal towns, the cleanup was underway with local and federal agencies working around the clock to clear debris, restore utilities, and provide emergency aid. Still, shortages of critical supplies combined with the widespread power outages and water contamination created major obstacles for recovery efforts, and further inland flooding continued to pose a threat for several days after the storm had passed. In North Carolina and Tennessee, heavy rainfall overwhelmed rivers and dams, leading to additional evacuations in low-lying areas. Rescuers remained on high alert, deploying helicopters and boats to assist residents trapped by rising waters. Organizations like FEMA, the Red Cross, and the Salvation Army provided food, shelter, and medical assistance to thousands displaced by the hurricane, yet the need for aid continued to grow with each passing day. Local leaders emphasized the importance of resilience and community solidarity, as volunteers and neighbors banded together to support those most affected by the storm's aftermath. In a testament to the widespread destruction left by Helene, it became clear that the storm's legacy would shape disaster response protocols for years to come. Government officials, emergency responders, and meteorologists all reflected on Helene's unprecedented impact. emphasizing the need for updated hurricane preparedness measures. As rebuilding efforts unfolded, communities also pushed for stronger infrastructure and improved flood defenses to withstand future storms. Although Helene's devastation left a lasting mark on the southeast, the resilience of these communities shone through as they began the long journey toward recovery and rebuilding.